Edenya is the new mega attraction at Pairi Daiza, the Belgium zoo of superlatives. A park that, like no other in Europe, has become synonymous with spectacular artificial scenery. And Edenya once again seems to fit that reputation perfectly. Built over the course of 4 years and with an estimated cost of around 215 million euros, it covers an area of 4 hectares and is now being presented as the largest tropical hall in the world. Around 1,800 plant species, roughly 230 animal species on land and in water, hotels, restaurants, and in the future even a water park. It promises a lot, but I was a bit skeptical beforehand, because behind its glossy facade, Pairi Daiza never quite convinced me that its animal husbandry consistently lives up to the same level as its visual spectacle. To put it bluntly, orangutans do not benefit much from an expensive, beautifully designed marble backdrop, for example. So I was very curious when I had the opportunity to explore Edenya for myself at opening day. And perhaps unsurprisingly, despite all the superlatives, that impression turned out to be rather mixed. So let's talk about it. How good is Edenya really? What worked for me, what didn't? And of course, the key question, should you plan a visit? Should you do it now, or might it be better to wait? Because one thing is clear, Edenya is not truly finished yet. On the one hand, the plants obviously still need a lot of time to grow and eventually create a dense jungle atmosphere. And on the other hand, it's equally obvious that the hall was pushed to open at all costs in time for the start of the season. I used to talk about video games professionally, and there it happens quite often that games are released in an unfinished state, only to be patched and updated later in the hope that they will eventually become what they were meant to be. And that is exactly how Edenya feels right now, pretty much like an open beta. Parts of the visit felt more like a construction site tour than a finished attraction. It was often dirty, it smelled of building work, and overall it's sometimes quite literally still rough around the edges. Several animal species have not even moved in yet. This pool, for example, is meant to house manatees in the future, but for us there was little more than an almost empty basin to look at. So one thing is clear from the get-go, if you can wait, then wait. In its current state, Edenya is still a long way from unfolding its full potential, and that is of course a factor that I have to take into account when evaluating in this video. At the moment, for example, there are still no free-flying birds inside the hall, and for me that's a genuinely crucial element to any tropical hall. It is precisely these birds that elsewhere ensure there is always something happening and something to discover, and especially acoustically, they contribute enormously to creating a true rainforest atmosphere. This makes it even harder to predict just how immersive the hall will ultimately be. One thing does seem clear though, Edenya is not necessarily designed to become as naturalistic as possible. The hall is not laid out like Burgers Busch in Arnhem, for example, where the focus lays on a large, continuous habitat into which only a handful of enclosures are embedded. Instead, it's more reminiscent of the Dôme Équatorial et Bouvard, where you move from one enclosure to the next and where the surrounding jungle vegetation creates an appealing backdrop, but is not the primarily focus in itself. Because even though the hall is enormous, with all the enclosures for many different animal species, as well as the restaurants and hotel facilities, this layout will never fully disappear beneath dense jungle vegetation. It will always remain a distinctly artificial tropical hall in terms of atmosphere closer to a theme park than to nature. That can be off-putting for some, but it does not have to be. Personally, I have to say that at least on first impression, the numerous hotel structures did bother me somewhat. The tree houses fit in reasonably well, but walking quite literally through hotel corridors to reach the underwater viewing areas for the manatees and sharks felt genuinely strange, but perhaps that is simply a matter of getting used to. As you have probably already noticed, the overall design is just as pompous as you would expect from Daiza. For example, setting aside the slightly odd experience of walking past hotel rooms, it is undeniably impressive how everything here has been laid out as if it were carved directly into rock. Whether one likes the fact, for example, that the pools for manatees and the sharks are not designed to look primarily natural, but instead resemble the ruins of an ancient temple, is ultimately a matter of taste. Some might say it is over the top, others will celebrate exactly that. And for the animals themselves, the backdrop is, in principle, largely irrelevant. But that brings me to the actual crux of the matter: animal husbandry. As I mentioned at the beginning, I generally do not feel that Daiza consistently strikes the perfect balance between impressive scenery and genuinely high-quality animal enclosures. Visually, much of it is beyond reproach, but with the trained eye, the quality of the enclosures from the animal's perspective does not always reach the same level. That doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, but it's not on the same level as the presentation. And unfortunately, this pattern continues in Edenya as well. In some cases in ways that would be fairly easy to fix, in others in ways that make me genuinely wonder what the thinking behind certain decisions was in the first place. But let's start with the part that I probably liked the most. Immediately to the left of the entrance, there is an area planted with numerous cacti. Since they do not need as much time to grow in densely as the jungle, this is currently the most visually appealing section of the entire hall for me. And for the lemurs, which can roam freely across most of the area, this represents a very well-designed habitat. For some it might be a conceptual or aesthetic flaw that Madagascar is not exactly known for its cacti, but if you look past that, this area does evoke something akin to a rocky thorn savanna where ring-tailed lemurs can indeed be found in the wild. The fossa enclosure is also nicely integrated. Visitors observe the animals from inside a cave through 3 large glass panes. As with several other species in the hall, it was noticeable that both the enclosure and the presence of visitors were still new to them, so they were very active and curious. That effect will inevitably wear off over time, and then it will become crucial how well the animals are kept stimulated through enrichment. At the moment, especially the climbing opportunities are something I would like to see expanded here. What did confuse me, however, was the mixed species setup planned for the ground level of this area. Porcupines, tortoises, and fennec foxes should still work together, but if I understood correctly, zebra mangooses are also supposed to be added. I have serious doubts that this will work, but I am happy to be proven wrong. What genuinely baffled me were the 2 enclosures for the Komodo dragons. At present, both are essentially little more than sand mounds with a few logs and a pool. There is no clear improvement compared to their former enclosure elsewhere in the park. From a visitor perspective, things have arguably become worse, since the animals can now only be seen from a distance, with their enclosure located behind the lazy river, through which bathers from the neighboring hall will eventually float. I honestly cannot make sense of that decision at all. I also do not quite understand why meerkats still have to be kept inside a tropical hall. That said, for a purely indoor enclosure, the setup itself is fundamentally quite solid. It would simply need more furnishing and, in the long run, consistent enrichment. A clear upgrade, on the other hand, is the enclosure for the Pygmy hippos, which are set to share their habitat with drills and the brothers monkeys. As you can see, the monkeys have an elevated area of their own, own in addition to the climbing structures. And that is exactly the kind of retreat space I would have liked to see on the opposite side of the water area for the pygmy hippos as well. Still, for a purely indoor setup, this enclosure is significantly better than, for example, the one in Gondwanaland in Leipzig, not least because it has been divided into two sections for these largely solitary animals, and since it can be connected and separated as needed, this is a solid setup especially with breeding in mind. And visitors can view this enclosure from a variety of angles, including from an elevated walkway. The giant otter enclosure next door might not necessarily be bad, but the very similar setup invites an unflattering comparison. It strongly reminds me of the exhibit in the large aviary at Parrot World near Paris, except that one is even bigger and better structured. Granted, that's one of the best giant otter enclosures I know, but it should really be Daiza's ambition to compete at exactly that level. Past these two habitats, a walkway lined with additional hotel rooms with view of the animals leads onward. And below that is a second level offering underwater viewing. On the opposite side, eels and crabs are set to move in later, while the enclosure at the end of the walkway is already home to alligators. That one I genuinely like a lot, especially compared to their former exhibit inside the hull of the ship that serves as Daiza's reptile house. Passing the largest restaurant in the hall, you then reach the currently still rather empty pools for manatees and sharks. Conceptually, I really like that there is a smaller front tank with a colorful coral reef through which you can look into the much larger shark tank behind it. What I don't understand, however, is why such a small enclosure was built right next to it for giant tortoises. It's incredibly cool to see coconut crabs here, but they could easily steal the show on their own. For the tortoises, I would much rather see a significantly larger enclosure elsewhere in the park, ideally with outdoor areas. Just compare it to the enclosure in Prague, for example. The difference is worlds apart. It's not much better for the sea turtles either, as their tank also feels quite cramped. In other facilities, they are often kept together with sharks and other species in the large main tank, and that's what I would prefer to see here in the future as well. Surely a more suitable species could be found for their current enclosure. There are also green iguanas on display, living in an enclosure that I did like quite enough. Still, in other tropical halls, they are often free roaming. Conceptually, I do like the idea of the chameleons living in a tree above another tortoise enclosure. However, that coloration is a sign of stress, though perhaps the animal simply still needs time to settle in. This area overall is actually pretty nice. The sloths have a large space here, with ropes allowing them to stroll above visitors' heads. The quaddy enclosure is also nicely designed, and once again they can move over visitors' heads to switch between two parts of their enclosure. At the rear end of the hall lies one of Edenya's largest habitats, where we saw lowland tapirs, capybaras and spider monkeys. Giant anteaters and even maned wolves are also supposed to move in. Another mixed species setup where I'm not entirely sure how well it will work, especially since the land area seems pretty tight for that many species. As you can see, the spider monkeys can of course avoid the other inhabitants by using the suspended ropes. Still, I'd love to see more ropes added in the future to make this space more complex. Right now it's essentially a two-dimensional setup where the monkeys can only move from left to right and back again. That should be relatively easy to improve. And that brings us to the Jaguar enclosure, which is once again impressively integrated into the hall. With underwater viewing, visitors are given every opportunity to experience the animals in a spectacular way, assuming they decide to show themselves. At least at the moment though, it feels as if more thought went into the surroundings than into the actual enclosure itself. It's not bad, but it could use more structure and above all more climbing opportunities. so it's definitely no match for the indoor habitat at Chester Zoo, which is my absolute favorite indoor jaguar enclosure. And there, the animals also have access to a spacious outdoor enclosure, allowing for rotation between individuals. I truly hope something similar is planned here, especially if more than one animal is kept. With some upgrades, this could become a genuinely excellent indoor habitat. From here, the path leads through an overnetted area filled with butterflies. Nothing unusual, but always a highlight, and here, once again, architecturally very impressively done. That leaves only the squirrel monkeys, who can, like the lemurs, explore an entire section of the hall. Unfortunately, one of the animals has already drowned. This once again underlines my point that water moats can become deadly traps, especially steep-sided ones like these. I sincerely hope lessons are learned and the design is adjusted, otherwise this likely won't remain an isolated incident. In general, it's only natural that such a massive hall needs time to settle in, and that adjustments have to be made after opening based on real operational experience. That applies to the visitor experience as well. For example, I would recommend clearly marking the narrow access path to the canopy walkway in advance. We suddenly found ourselves standing in line for a good 10 minutes, only for parents with children who were too small to be turned away at the very end. Issues like that are understandable and normal at first, but they need to be addressed and resolved. And don't make a mistake about it, the potential for an absolutely outstanding visitor experience is unmistakable. Even though some more species, like the gharials, hadn't yet moved in, we still spent over 3 hours here and easily could have stayed even longer. Once everything is in place and fully established, Edenya will offer an incredibly diversity of fascinating animals, even if, aside from the manatees, it might lack the one ultra-rare headline species typically associated with Pairi Daiza. But that doesn't really matter here. At the moment there were still areas with little to see due to empty exhibits and the absence of free-flying birds. The Lyle's flying foxes were also not out yet. But in the future, this is likely to be a hall where there's something to discover in every corner. So I'm quite certain this will become a truly grand visitor experience once it no longer feels slightly like a construction site. Especially considering the immense size, they seem to have done an impressive job implementing a very effective visitor flow through a cleverly designed network of pathways. So in many respects, Edenya is undoubtedly a remarkable achievement. Even though it's not quite finished yet, it's already astonishing what have been built here in what is still a relatively short construction period. How good the hall will be in 1 or 2 years, however, will depend, at least for me, on whether they are willing to rethink and adjust certain aspects of animal husbandry. Smaller improvements such as enhanced climbing structures should certainly be feasible, but especially regarding the tortoises, I would very much like to see a more radical change. If the insights gained after opening are used to further optimize the hall, Edenya has the potential not only to be the largest tropical hall, but also perhaps even the best. Though, as always, that ultimately comes down to personal taste. So, what do you think? Has Edenya convinced you already? Let me know, especially if you've been there yourself. And otherwise, what's your favorite tropical hall? Drop it in the comments, leave a like, hit subscribe, you know the drill. But before we come to an end, one more thing. Edenya does cost an additional extra fee, and for a normal adult visitors, that now means that additionally to 54 euros already, you have to pay another 7. The hall cannot be visited as a standalone experience, so if you want to see it, you have to pay the full 60 euros. And by now, it's effectively impossible to truly experience everything Pairi Daiza has to offer in a single day, and that's a real issue for me. Of course, this makes the wide range of on-site accommodations all the more appealing, and that's probably intentional, but this pricing policy isn't exactly family friendly. If I'm paying 60 euros more than I ever paid for a zoo and still can't even come close to seeing everything, it starts to feel excessive. More isn't always better, even if the park's success so far seems to prove them right. In any case, thank you very much for watching, take care, see you soon, goodbye und auf Wiedersehen, yours truly, Martin.